Hello and welcome to this video. This video is going to be called The 10 Greatest Progressive Rock Albums of All Time. Now some of you might say to me, well, you've already done that video. And I was actually watching the video that was called My 10 Greatest Prog Albums of All Time. I was watching it, I was thinking this is great, and it's very much my experience of prog, and I've ranked my favourite 10 albums. And I thought, I wonder if it's possible to come up with something that's a little bit more objective. Of course, this is still going to be influenced by my taste, but I thought, I wonder if I could come up with an objective list of the 10 greatest progressive rock albums of all time. So I started making lists, and it was quite interesting because there was two bands, ELP and Pink Floyd, that weren't included on my last video. And I thought they've got to be, especially Pink Floyd. I mean, this is one of the biggest bands in the world, and ELP almost defined the genre. So I've been working for a few days trying to come up with a definitive 10, and I think I've come up with it. Some of these albums are albums I'm really familiar with. Some of them I'm really aware of their influence importance, but I'm not as knowledgeable on them. But of course I know them, I've heard them many times. So shall we start at number 10 on my 10 definitive progressive rock albums of all time. And I'm going to rank them from 10 to 1 as well. So are you ready for this? Are you ready for this? This is the 10, this is the list. You know, you're going to get ready with your little pen and paper ready for all the artists and albums and bands I didn't include, you know. So we're going to have a proper argument about this, because I'm saying this is the 10 definitive. Here we go. Right, are you ready? At number 10, oh, see, this one I had to put on, and this is my own personal taste. So at number 10, I still have Gong YOU. I think YOU is the perfect album. It's the perfect progressive rock album. Gong do something, and they pull together English influences, and they pull together European prog influences. There's not that much European prog on this list. There's not that much American prog. I really think prog, in terms of ultimate greatness, is rooted in bands that came out of the UK. Gong really represent, though, that European influence, and I think on the album YOU, it's such a masterpiece. It is completely perfect as far as I'm concerned in terms of conception, playing, sound, the whole production. It's just a monumental album. If you've not heard YOU by Gong, go and check it out. And its influence on later rave, dance music, electronic music is unparalleled. So it also pulls in that sort of electronica aspect that is so important to the history of prog. Gong, of course, was a sort of British-French progressive rock band formed by David Allen. They merged in the early 70s. They take a little bit of time to get going, but they really hit their stride with a trilogy of albums called the Flying Teapot Trilogy. The first one being Radio Name Invisible, and then the next one is Angel's Egg, and then the third one, the sort of summit of that trilogy, is YOU. And I've done a video on that trilogy if you want to check it out. David Allen sort of leaves in the mid-70s. He goes off and does all sorts of different things. One of the most important things for me is he actually makes an album called New York Gong with Bill Laswell, and then sort of kicks in that whole material Bill Laswell world, which I've done a whole ton of videos about. But Gong itself sort of goes under the stewardship of Pierre Morlan and sort of slowly turns into a jazz fusion group, and they make another trilogy of albums, Espresso, Espresso 2, and Time is the Key, and that also is like a trilogy, incredible Gong trilogy. But the peak, their greatest moment, is YOU. It all comes together: the fusion, the electronica, the trance, the prog, the conceptual mightiness of this band. And I think that Gong YOU is without doubt one of the greatest albums ever made, objectively. And I had to put it on the list. So at number 10 I have YOU by Gong. At number 9, I have an album that I sort of missed out on when I was a youngster. It's only more recently I've listened to it, and it's a very difficult listen for me. But it's the album Porn Hearts by Van der Graaf Generator. Van der Graaf Generator were formed in 1967. They make their first album in 1969. They were the first act to sign to Charisma. So they have a sort of sound which is a darker... It's it's debatable whether you could call them prog. Van der Graaf Generator almost create their own genre. It's much darker than most British prog. There's elements of Genesis in there, there's elements of King Crimson in there, but of course they are pioneers of this genre. By the time they get to 1970, they are making full-on prog albums, and Porn Hearts, which came out in 1971, contains a sidelong epic, which is quite incredible. This is a dark, mysterious album. Peter Hamill's vocals are unlike anything you can think of in the history of rock music. He uses the full range of his voice, from screams to shouts to expressiveness. His influence on pop music is unparalleled. You can hear the huge influences of his vocal approach in two singers at least that I'm just going to mention. The first, of course, is John Lydon. You know, for all the Sex Pistols and Punk's hatred of prog, you could see that John Lydon has really taken a lot of his vocal approach from Peter Hamill. But another singer that's also done it is Bruce Dickinson. When I listened to Porn Arts again for this video, I was thinking, I can, this phrasing, I know it. I know it from somewhere else, and I realised it was Bruce Dickinson. I checked it out and found out that Bruce Dickinson is also a huge Van der Graaf Generator fan. This album was not a huge success in the UK, but was absolutely a monumental success in Italy. Van der Graaf Generator actually went to Italy to tour, and they were almost like mobbed in the streets, you know. It was so successful, and that really allowed the band to keep going, I think, was that financial success. But they didn't last long, and they sort of imploded. I think they just did too much in the early 70s, and they disappeared off the map, which I think is why they didn't quite get their claws into the genre in the same way as Genesis or Yes or King Crimson did. They do re-emerge in 1975, and they come back with a little bit more of a focused sound, and then they call it a day at the end of the 70s. They've recently reformed as a trio, so they're still out there doing this. I think going back to this album, it's really interesting because the first prog I probably ever heard was the tune Theme 1, which was the title tune for the Tommy Vance radio show, rock radio show, that anyone in the UK will know was so important to any musician of my age. That track didn't appear on Porn Hearts, but was recorded in the same session. So it's really bizarre that I was aware of this album in a way right from when I first started listening to music. And that sound that you hear in Theme 1 extends out towards across the whole of this album. Going back and listening to it again, there are some absolutely incredible moments. They have their own sound, which is so dark and churning. It is somewhere between Genesis and King Crimson. Really hard to pigeonhole this band. I think they occupy a space in their own. I'm really happy to have been able to talk about them finally on my channel. I'm going to move on there to number 8. At number 8, I have Thick as a Brick by Jethro Tull. All right. I think in terms of progressive rock, Thick as a Brick is a very, very important album. This is the album where, after being accused of being a prog rock band and making conceptual albums with Akerlung, Ian Anderson decided to parody that with Thick as a Brick, and we have one of the most progressive rock albums of all time, and it truly is one of the greatest progressive rock albums. Is it my favourite Jethro Tull album? No, I like Song of the Woods very, very much. I like Stand Up very, very much. There's a whole ton of stuff I love by Jethro Tull, but I think in terms of prog rock and what they attempted to do, which is a whole conceptual album, I'm not going to get into it here, but it's like a newspaper which has a story about this boy, and this story is then extended out over a whole album. It's very, very tongue-in-cheek. It's a fantastic album. Jethro Tull have a beautiful sound which sort of marries up sort of blues rock with progressive classical elements, bits of jazz, and most importantly English folk and folklore sounds. It's not just English folk music. There's almost like a medieval sound to Jethro Tull. So that's what I have at number 8, is Thick as a Brick by Jethro Tull. And of course, as anyone who knows that album, that is an absolute prog classic. So what are we going to have? What's the next 7 going to be like? So at number 7, I have an ELP album. ELP didn't make the list when I did this, when I did my more personalised version. And actually, in doing this channel, and discussing ELP, and my lovely followers with their incredible comments that they put in has made me to go back and reevaluate ELP. And I had to grudgingly say to them, well, I do love Trilogy. Trilogy is an incredible album, and Trilogy was nearly the one I was going to put on the list. Also, I really love side one, Tarkus, the Tarkus Epic. That's a very important progressive rock track. And what you hear on that is Keith Emerson's absolute genius. This is one of the architects of progressive rock. His compositional ability and approach and technique is so advanced that I think he really does lay the groundwork to successfully creating long form, classically influenced compositions in prog. He's the master of that. Right, so I thought Tarkus, well, the side 2 of Tarkus is a bit weak. The first album's great. I thought Trilogy is absolutely fantastic, but the album where they all comes together, which it works all the way through, except for one track, which is Benny the Bouncer, is of course Brain Salad Surgery. And I realised my dislike of Benny the Bouncer, which is a sort of a bit of a joke track, I realised I may not have been seeing ELP in their own terms, right? Because ELP are light-hearted at some points. They do like to go into areas of sort of English vaudeville and comedy, which I should love, and I do love it. And I thought, isn't it incredible on this incredibly dark album with that incredible, you know, goth cover and the whole thing that Brain Salad Surgery represents, and the Welcome Back My Friends, all that, those 3 tracks are absolutely the peak of ELP, that I shouldn't be prejudiced against that one track, because actually having that in there almost like is the icing on the cake for that album. I think their creative peak is Brain Salad Surgery, so that's what I've got at number 7. So all you ELP fans will now be happy that I have got them on the list. Right, what have I got at number 6? What's greater than ELP? Well, at number 6 I have OCTOPUS by Gentle Giant. I've always said Gentle Giant is like prog's prog, right? They are just astonishing. You know, anybody who likes progressive rock and likes what progressive rock does, when you hear Gentle Giant, it's like, oh my god, this is prog to the max. The virtuosity, the composition, the signature sound, the production, the conceptual ideas that run through it. The Gentle Giant just nail it. And they don't really put a foot wrong until the mid to late 70s. You know, they make a run of incredible albums. I could have put 3 Friends on the list. You know, I could have put Power of Glory on the list. I could have put In the Glass House on the list. I could put Freehand on the list, which is the album I personally is my favourite. It was the one I put up on my much more subjective list. But I think the only reason why I've put OCTOPUS on the list is it is flawless. It's a perfect album, as is many of the other albums. It just happens to sport a Roger Dean cover. And that one little thing just edges it up because it now puts it into the realm of prog masterpiece. That is so shallow, but that is the way I see it. And that is not to denigrate OCTOPUS in any way. OCTOPUS is a perfect prog album, right? They've also made other albums. I think 3 Friends is vying for greatness on here, but also on 3 Friends we don't have John Weathers, and I think John Weathers is so important to the Gentle Giant sound, because Gentle Giant is so complex that he takes his ego out of it and he finds a simple way of just pummeling through with these straight rock beats and straight funk grooves, still being able to play all the complexity. But he creates such an underpinning, which I think is really helps Gentle Giant then create the masterpieces, you know, that they go on to do, and that's where you hear that on OCTOPUS. It's one of the great progressive rock albums. What can I say? All of these are as great as each other. I've tried to get this on the list, and the albums above it are probably there just because of the fact they sold more, or they had a greater influence on the genre. That's it. I think OCTOPUS is one of the greatest progressive rock albums ever made. What do I have at number 5? Moving Pictures by Rush. Rush have to be on this list. We have to represent America in some way. And so I think there's some great American progressive rock groups. Kansas, of course. There's Utopia, Todd Rundgren. But Rush occupy a special place in progressive rock because of the huge success they had. They start off as a sort of Led Zeppelin sort of blues rock band with sort of sword and sorcery imagery. When Neil Peart joins the band, that amps up, and they move towards the first prog masterpieces, which is 2112. And I was going to put that on the list, but for me, 2112, side one's incredible. Side two's a little uneven. And I would say Farewell to Kings is a greater album, as is Hemispheres. But with Moving Pictures, they create a sublime album, which is utterly incredible. They don't put a foot wrong. And that's what I wanted on this list, is albums where they just did not put a foot wrong. And of course, the reason why this isn't a classic prog album like 2112 is because they're moving into the 1980s. And so by having this album on the list, it represents all the stuff that's going to come in later in the 80s, 90s and up to the 2000s. We're talking, you know, things like the neo-prog stuff, then Dream Theater, all that type of things, Porcupine Tree, all that type of stuff that's going to come in. Really, you could see the way to do that was really nailed on Moving Pictures. Is it a progressive rock album? Of course it is. There's a 10-minute track called Camera Eyes, an epic on there. There's an instrumental YYZ, you know, where they do all the virtuoso thing. There's all the sort of story. It is a progressive rock album. It is. It's an out-and-out progressive rock album. And it is absolutely perfect. It sold millions and millions. It's got to be on the list. It's got to be pretty high. Rush are one of the most important progressive rock bands in its history. So at number 5, we have Moving Pictures. At number 4, I was going to put on In the Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson. This is the album where the genre was born, all right? But for me personally, much as I like 21st century Schizoid Man, I love that, and there's some other great moments on there. The album, the genre's not quite defined, and I think they do meander in places. There's one place in the Court of the Crimson King where they really do meander. They're trying to explore free jazz and they're noodling about. And for me, I really love this album. When we were talking about greatness, but for me, it's not a perfect album. It's the album that opens the door. There are a number of albums by King Crimson that are pretty perfect. The most perfect album is Red, and that's what I've got at number 4 is Red by King Crimson. Every track on there is absolutely sublime and perfect. It does everything that King Crimson do. On Starless, they create one of the great epics of all time by any prog band. It ushers in the second King Crimson sound, because King Crimson for me redefined prog. You know, they create prog, and then everybody follows in, and they're all doing their sidelong epics, and there's all those classical sounds and the mellotron and all that type of stuff. And then when in 1972, when Bill Bruford joins, he creates a heavier, darker prog, and this is really going to open the doors to prog metal and a whole bunch of stuff, and that needs to be represented on here. Red is the peak. Red is so influential, and you've got to remember that Kurt Cobain was a big fan of Red, and you can hear the sound of King Crimson in Nirvana, right? So you can hear the sound of King Crimson in Soundgarden. So the influence outside the genre is absolutely great. I'm pretty sure that their most important album in terms of that band, which is one of the most influential, important bands in progressive rock, is Red. I really do think that's the case. So that's what I got at number 4. It's also one of my favourite progressive rock albums of all time. It's one of the greats. So what have I got at number 3? Right, this band didn't make the list when I first did this, and now I've become a bit more objective and sat back. They have made the list, and I wasn't going to put this album on to start off with. Originally, I was going to put on Atom Heart Mother by Pink Floyd. Right. In doing this channel, a number of people said, "Have you checked out Atom Heart Mother?" Now, I heard that as a very young lad. And I've got to be, I think it went over my head when I was very young. I didn't quite get it. And, you know, I then got Gummer, and I didn't get that as well. That was very experimental. But it was mentioned a number of times. So I actually sat down and listened to it again. And I was absolutely shocked at the Atom Heart Mother Side 1 epic made in 1970. This is just one of the great moments of progressive rock. So when I put this list together, I thought that is so important. Let's put Atom Heart Mother on. Then I sat back and thought, well, yeah, but if you're going to put Pink Floyd on, you have to put Dark Side of the Moon on. It's a perfect album. It's flawless. It's had a huge cultural impact. It's innovative. It defines the genre. And I thought, yeah, you've got to have it on. At number 3, there's a strong argument that we have this at number 1, but at number 3, I've got Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd. For me, that's their creative peak. When they move on to Wish You Were Here, that's another fantastic album. But it moves into a certain aspect of Pink Floyd that I don't like so much. I love the sort of sit back psychedelic thing. I really love that. I like the fact that they're so experimental. They're groundbreaking, and they really are groundbreaking on Atom Heart Mother. Right? Then they do Dark Side of the Moon, and all that's in there. And then they sort of move into this sort of dad rock area for me a little bit, and that's what you get on Wish You Were Here. Is Wish You Were Here a great album? Oh my god, yeah, I think it's fantastic, but that starts to emerge. Animals is a really, really fantastic album, really, really great. You know, I would think if I was to say their 3 greatest albums, it would be Atom Heart Mother, Dark Side of the Moon, and Animals. The Wall, I'm not a fan of at all, and then from then on, they lose me completely. So I really think their creative peak is Dark Side of the Moon, and that is evidenced by the huge success, the millions and millions of albums that this sold. And this is a heavy album. I'm very proud that this genre that we love so much was able to produce an album like Dark Side of the Moon, which has touched so many people. It's a very, very important album in the history of rock music, and that's what we have at number 3. Right, at number 2, we have Foxtrot by Genesis, right? This was going to be Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, and I nearly put it in, but I thought, yeah, even though I love that album, right, it is a little bit flawed. It's a little bit meandery in places. There's certain tracks where they're not hitting 10 out of 10. They're hitting 8 or 9 out of 10, right? My favourite Genesis album is Nursery Crime. I love the sound of that album, but that's very subjective. It was the first Genesis album I ever got, and it was what made me love Genesis. So I love the sound of Nursery Crime. Selling England by the Pound would be the choice for many. I've never warmed for that album that much. I actually don't like the production on that album. It doesn't seem to quite have the magical Genesis sound that Foxtrot and Nursery Crime have. Foxtrot is the perfect album, right? And Supper's Ready is one of the greatest moments in progressive rock. And if I was going to pick one track by Genesis to represent them and their importance in the history of this genre, it would be Supper's Ready, which is an absolute masterpiece. But all the other tracks on there are masterpieces. They're all masterpieces. Foxtrot for me is the perfect album, right? It's not the album I know so well. Actually, it took me a while to get to that album. I was into Abacab and the Duke as well before I got to Foxtrot. But standing back objectively, I think Foxtrot is where they really define what they are as a progressive rock band and create the masterpiece. So that's what I've got at number 2 is Foxtrot. What have I got at number 1? Close to the Edge by Yes. What can we say? It was my number 1 before. It's the perfect prog album. It's a masterpiece. Absolutely defines the genre and everything. It sold loads of records. It was so hugely influential. So at number 1, I have Close to the Edge by Yes. That's my video. I'm done. Did I do all right? How close is that? Do you think we'd come up with a list? I'm sure you've got your suggestions, so put them down in the comments. And if you like the video, like it, subscribe. And if you want to support me on Patreon, support me on Patreon. I'd love you to do that. I'll see you on the next video. Thanks a lot. Andy, so that's your 10 greatest progressive rock albums, is it? So here I am, 6 months later. This video went on to become the most successful video on my channel. And I was looking at it the other day and I thought, God, this has been seen so many times by tens of thousands of people, and I got no album covers on it. So I thought I wanted to put it out again with a few photos and a few pictures and just tart it up a bit. That's what I wanted to do. And I thought it'd be nice to just put a little bit on the end where I give you my opinion right now. And I'm pretty much in agreement with everything that I said on that video. I think I'm pretty much there. There's a couple of things I would change, you know, and that's really come out of doing this channel. When you do a video on something here, what happens is then everyone gives you suggestions about what you've just talked about, and sometimes you start to change your opinion. Now, there's a little bit of a backlash against You by Gong. You know what I think about that? I think they're all wrong. They don't know the album. It's not that well known. Gong You is a complete, utter masterpiece, and it really foreshadows a whole ton of music that's not going to come out until the late 80s, early 90s. Absolutely such an influential album, and people suggesting that I put this weird European prog albums in, you know, no way, I ain't getting rid of You. So that's the way it is. But when I put the Van der Graaf Generator album on the list, there had been such reaction from the channel before I did that video, where so many people saying, why are you talking about Van der Graaf Generator? What do you think about them? Blah, blah, blah. And the truth be told, I had never really listened to them that much. Since then, I've listened to them a lot. And I've listened to Porn Hearts a lot. And my conclusion is, because I listened to it a couple of times before I put it in the video, I've since listened to it over and over again. And my conclusion is, I hate it. It's just so doomy and dull. When they kick into gear, it's great, you know. But it's just, and it's so disjointed. I just do not understand it. Now, do I want to take it off the list? That's the question. Well, the problem is there's one album that I didn't put on, and I felt it needs to go on the list because it's such an important progressive rock album. It's so influential on all of music, and it sold tens of millions of copies, and that's Tubular Bells. So I think if I do this again, because I'm going to redo this summer, and this is just my thought process for those of you interested, it could well be that Van der Graaf Generator have gone, and in comes Tubular Bells. Right now, I know the hardcore proggers, because Van der Graaf Generator is such a hardcore proggers band. You've really got to be into you know, prog, I think. And I think they represent a sort of gothic end of prog, which emerges more later. You know, there's a lot of people who like these doomy progressive rock bands. You know, they want to be confused and depressed at the same time, you know, and they're going to be moaning. I know you're all moaning now. How can you not like it? And I'm sure they're giving me all other albums that I should be listening to. But it's my channel, and I've tried to listen, and I've listened to all the other ones. God, they are boring. If you come here for my opinion, sometimes I try and be as objective as I possibly can. Sometimes I try and say, don't put aside what you like. What is the great album? What's the important album? And sometimes that is what you've got to do. The viewers want to hear me try and be as objective as you possibly can. But sometimes you've got to bring in your own opinion. Van der Graaf Generator are turgid, dull and boring. Right? Their compositions are weak. They don't know how to structure something. They clunk from one thing to the next. And Peter Hamill's vocal sound is very Marmitey. Any British people know what I mean by that, and if you don't, then you'll have to look it up. They're Marmitey. He's Marmitey. Don't know. So I've got rid of them. Now, I've never been a huge fan of Tubular Bells, but there we have an album that is so important to the history of progressive rock. This is the first album where one person made an album. All music's made like that now. It's some person in their room, the producer. The producer is no longer the guy that eats pizza and tells everybody what to do. He's the person who sits there with Pro Tools or whatever, or Ableton Live, and creates the track that the singer then comes and squirts some vocals on, and then he takes that and tunes it all in. You know, Mike Oldfield had pioneered this before, so I'm going to take out Porn Hearts and I'm going to stick in Tubular Bells. Right. The other change I'm going to make is the Gentle Giant album. Gentle Giant have to make the list. They are one of the greatest progressive rock bands of all time, and they have to make the list. doing this channel, and I've recently just done a great discussion video where I just discussed with my mate Steve Gould what is the best Gentle Giant album, and we came to the conclusion, or well I did for me, that it was In a Glass House. It was either Three Friends, In a Glass House or Freehand. And listening to them as I have so often for this channel, I think In a Glass House just edges over Octopus as a work of genius. I think we're all put off by that Roger Dean album cover, aren't we? It's so great, we want to say that's the greatest Gentle Giant album. But in the end, In a Glass House, with that sort of big track, small track, big track, and then side two, big track, small track, big track, it's just that little bit more proggy, it's just that little bit more epic, and they just are at the peak of their powers, right? Now, as part of that, I'm going to keep everything where it is, but there is another album that's vying for this list, and I'm going to tell you about it now. It's Sing to God by Cardiacs, a double album of utter prog genius, and it's vying for me to be one of the greatest progressive rock albums ever. I've been a Cardiacs fan for many years, but it's a difficult catalogue to get your head round, and to be honest, Sing to God has been an album that I've been putting aside. I have discovered it this year big time. It's incredible. So Sing to God may well make the list. What am I going to kick off? That's the question. What do you kick off this list to put Sing to God? Is it just you make it at 11? You know, but I would maybe put it higher than some of the other albums on this list. It's just a work of utter genius. So there's my thoughts on this Redux revamped version of my most successful video on this channel, and I can now sleep in my bed feeling that this video, which has been seen by tens of thousands of people, that I can sleep happier that I've in a little bit more agreement. I'm gonna have to do this quite a lot. I will revisit some of these lists. So I hope you like this little coda that I've added on to the end of the video. If you did, like, subscribe, come and see me at Patreon, ring the bell, all that stuff, and I'll see you in the next video.